Real people,
real conversation, real talk. We're having a big issue with voter ID, and I was reading an article and they said that they're trying to cut out fraud. Now, according to the fraud I saw, they only had since 2000, they had 86 cases of fraud nationally.
86 cases. The organization called Media 21 doing some good work right now to kind of squash all, just basically just get all the information out that needs to be out there. And 86 cases since 2000. Now, mind you, that's so every 4 years we have these elections with the president and everything else. So we've had at least 3 elections: 2000, 2004, 2008. That means over just under 200 million voters, and they found 86 cases. So. And what we're talking about is that these IDs only deals with one, there is this idea called voter fraud, but it's more on another side of things. The voter ID, what they're trying to get us to do now, it doesn't alleviate the major issues. Again, 86 cases of in-person voter impersonation. Which is far different. If we want to start dealing with some other issues, that I'm willing to work with anyone on this as well, is the potential for a registration fraud, potential for actually it's just mainly registration fraud that we'd have to really cap down, and there's very little of that as well.
Well, here's my question for you. Out of the 86, they said that only 46 of those was actually prosecuted. Or 46% of those were killed, meaning there was no fraud on those. They got rid of the case. They didn't file on them.
So and this is what happens. It's, the intent is brought out, and usually what happens is that either a person who is not yet eligible to vote because of their their connection into the criminal justice system, they either are still on paper, on parole or on probation. They're still, they're not sure because PO's not handling their business and actually the necessary information. And there's actually been bills in the state of Minnesota to rectify that. So it kind of helps the POs as well as the individual who is trying to have their civil rights restored. That's been pushed aside as well. So what cracks me up about this whole thing of voter ID fraud, and again, it's voter impersonation. It's literally me taking your place in the polls. That doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen.
Well, and here's the question that I have for you. Basically the way I look at it is, and a lot of people that talk about it, they say, well, you have to have an ID for everything. You have to have an ID to get beer. You have to even if you want to go get your mail from the mail service, you have to have an ID that says you are who you are. So what's the difference of that? What's the difference of that and saying you have to have an ID to vote?
Well, simple. In the Constitution, all the way around, and a lot of people will debate this one, but we are not obliged to have a photo ID to be a citizen of the United States of America. We have other documentation behind that, your social security number and everything else. And when you register to vote, you have to show an ID in order to have that done. So you have that other identification. And there's millions of Americans and several 100,000 in the state of Minnesota who don't have IDs, picture IDs, for multiple reasons. And they're still able to do the other business because of the agreement between that company or that establishment and their rules and that individual. It's a choice to be able to go into a bar, to a bank, or to whatever else. It is not only a right, but it's also a privilege to vote. It's guaranteed by the 14th, 15th, and I forget whether one today because I'm just off my game, but no other way around it. It's constitutionally protected that we have the right to participate in this process. All we would like to see, and I think everybody can agree to this, that we want to see fair, free, and accessible election polls. We want to see as many people participate, regardless of who they vote for.
Okay.
When people are participating in their process, they're more apt to be more engaged in the development of their society, the development of their community. But when we try to freeze people out and say we don't, over a technicality,
okay,
and that's and what they're trying to do right now is get us to have it's that little hood switch, you know.
Okay.
It's the government not saying necessarily that we did this to you. Mm-hmm. Y'all did this by voting on this.
Okay.
But when you look at states like Maine, as soon as they found out that what it takes away is same-day voter registration.
Yes.
Now all of a sudden, you know, I can't go to the poll if I just moved in, you know, and I live in a community. I just moved within 2 months. I don't have a necessary picture ID, and I'll go deeper into what it actually means to say voter ID. I can't vote now just because I moved, or I might have lost my wallet the day before. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be able to vote.
Now, here's something I have to say on that, Ben. Mm-hmm. When they say this, what I've noticed is that some of the main states that it's a big controversy are the states that are so-called swing states. Yeah. It's not a controversy in states that in my opinion, the Republicans have basically said we're never going to win that state, so let that state sit. And those states don't have voter ID laws. Right. They're trying to pass the law in states. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, which Minnesota really isn't a swing state. Technically, they vote Democratic.
But if you start to carve out 8 to 10% of the potential electorate, now it becomes a swing state. It becomes a very tight race. You got to remember that in the state of Minnesota, we've had the gubernatorial election determined by less than 9,000 votes out of 2.1 million cast. You've had the Senate race, a couple of years ago, determined by less than 300 votes. We've had close elections across the board, so it's not that we're not a swing state. When you carve out 8 to 10% of an electorate, that's huge. And here's the thing, and this stat was staggering to me. And 32 of the 33 legislative bodies across the state that currently have some type of form of voter ID, those 32 of them were Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican administration. Okay. So it just sailed through. Only one state only actually had a bipartisan approach. Hey there. So it's very clear, and if you remember that video of the majority leader in Pennsylvania, Mike Tarazi.
Yes.
Now again, Pennsylvania goes heavily Democratic every time. Mm-hmm. Big union area, big,
steel. They got steels and everything.
Steel and everything else. Very, very strong, Democratic, again. But now this time, Republican House, Republican Senate.
Yes.
And Republican governor.
Okay.
And sure enough, and it was done during an off year where a lot of people don't show up. So, everybody keeps saying that, Pennsylvania goes blue every 4 years for the presidential, but when you lose 8 to 10% of the electorate, and mainly it's people who normally would vote for a Democratic candidate.
Definitely.
Game over, and you start to see it. And they were able to also control redistricting, which then created more districts and everything else. Again, this whole process is about politicians choosing their voters.
Okay.
Voters choosing their
politicians. And here's the question: who's going to be most affected by the voter ID laws as we see it today? Because I say that it's like I pointed out to some of my friends. they're kind of aiming it towards the minorities a little bit, right?
No, not a little bit. They're aiming it towards. They're aiming it towards seniors who definitely have more of a propensity to vote Democratic because of the support that Democratic ticket and Democratic leadership has had on issues that seniors definitely care about: Medicaid, Medicare. You know, definitely Social Security benefits and everything else. You know, seniors, you know, vote heavier towards Democratic side. Young people, I mean, we're talking college students. Let me talk about that ID first and foremost. And yesterday was a prime example. I had to re-register and it's actually appropriate that we're right here. Family lived here for, I mean, basically voted in the house for 40 some odd years. That was my mom's house, right here. I actually got 2 stories on this as I'm thinking about it. So this is where I registered to vote. I moved upstairs, and, you know, I need to actually re-register myself, you know, because I live in a different address now, 2112.
Okay.
Now, if I was to go in, you know, say this thing passes, and I had my registration at one place, 2110, but my ID said 2112, I would not be allowed to vote until I got my ID to match up, or the registration to match up.
Well, how do they check this to make sure that it matches up correctly?
They check it through, I mean, there's 14 different steps, you know, for a registration to actually be valid in the state of Minnesota. So from the time that I get a voter registration card from you, there are 14 different things that take place, and it's literally matching up, and that's why it takes so long to make sure that people are on the roll properly. It is literally, they're making sure that Social Security number, the last 4 digits are matched up with that individual.
Okay.
So, I mean, right off the bat, that's locked in. You're talking also about, you know, tying in with other utilities and other things that can be used as well. DMV comes into play as well. If I can use the driver's license and match up from there. Okay. Making sure the proper spelling of the name and everything else. So it's a very extensive process. So we don't take things lightly here in the state of Minnesota, nor actually many places in the United States as it relates to registration. So again, it's the whole thing of, you know, if I'm off by 2 digits, you know, 2110 is where I was registered, you know, to vote, and I live at 2112. Okay. My ID says 2112, but it doesn't connect with 2110. I would not be able to vote. They have this thing called provisional ballots, where I would have to come back and show another photo ID. And let me be very clear, it's a state-issued ID. You could not use a passport. I mean, what other way can you say who you are? So what they're saying is, so let me get this straight. First of all, they're disenfranchising the young voters. They're going after young. Because most people go, I'd say about 70% of students go out of state. Is it smaller than that? I mean, even not, I don't think it's that high, but they move from one place to another. Case in point, I mean, I went to Hampton University of Virginia. So yes. I would have had to get an ID, a state-issued ID. A license. Yeah. Okay. Or identification. Which, how could you if you're in that state? Because technically speaking, you're a visitor. That's number one. And number two, not only are you a visitor, but number two, it's you don't really have a legitimate address. Exactly. That address changes every 4 years. No, well, every year. You think about it, you move dorm room, because actually what the whole idea was, if I moved dorm rooms, I would have to get another ID for the next election. And which is the midterm elections. Which is the midterm elections, or even the municipalities. Which is a local, okay. Exactly. So you think about all that chaos that we're going to create if we even put this thing in. The cost itself. Well, because you got to remember, if I can't, you will be provided, as it says in the election language, we will provide you, and it's also in the legislation, provide a free ID if you cannot afford, if you have to get one. Who's going to pay for it? Well, it still gets paid for by the citizens of the state of Minnesota. We still pay for it. So it's a tax increase. It's a tax increase. Real people. Real conversation. Real talk.